This week we are doing the Daf Chav Zayin 27, we're starting on Chavav Amadalid, which begins with Bir Advarim, which is a beer on Sanor the second Sanor that we do in the Likkutei Torah. He says Bir Advarim, explanation of this. So we see that the level of Keser, which refers to the crown, is higher than all the 10 spheres, and it is the source of pleasure. Which is the level of Soiv Kolamin, the light that surrounds the worlds, and that's the level of Keser. On the other hand, the beginning of Ishtalshalos of Atzilus, which is Mamala Kolamin, the light that fills the world, begins from Chacham. He says that's an H. It's Chaim, and it brings a few sources. And the Chacham, which is the source of Atzilus, the Chacham is the source of Atzilus. Why? Because the main Atzilus is the level of Tikkun from the world of Tayu. And we know that Tayu is where the levels, everything broke, all the vessels broke. And how do you refine? The Chachma is spiritu. The refinement happens through the level of Chachma. And the reason is because the idea of the breaking that happened in the world of Tayu, that is, that it came into a level of self. And the tikkun is that it should become selfless, it should become ayin again. And that is through the level of Chachma, which is Kayachma. The power of what? Which Kayachma refers to Chachma. She says now, Chachma itself also has in it 10 spheres. And from the Keser of Chachma, which is the highest, until the level of Tiferes, which is basically the middle, that first half is called Abba, it's called Father. Then the lower half, and mainly the level of Netzach and Hoid, are called Yisrael Saba, the old Yisrael. In other words, Zah is called regular Yisrael, or Zer Ampin, small faces. Yisrael Saba means the old Yisrael. So this is the level of Netzach and Hoid, which is higher, which is still within Chachma. And he says, from here comes the source of all neshamas. And he says why? Because Netzach and Hoid, which is the level of victory and the level of splendor, they are how the Chachma is given, is mashpia, is hashpa sa Chachma, the actual givings, the actual when you word hashpa here, I'm losing the words here, but when you give something over to somebody else, or you give a hashpa of food, or hamshachas atipa, all this is called hashpa. So the hashpa is of a chachma is netzach and hoid. Why? Because netzach and hoid, they are the vessels of the hashpa, and that's what brings the life force from the higher level to a lower level. Only that it's the hashpa as it is in Atzilus before it comes to a revealed neshama itself, and the revelation of the neshama itself is the Yisrael as it is lower in the level of Zah. But the source of the revelation in Chachma is called Yisrael Sava, as it says, "V'yismechu b'cha Yisrael," that Yisrael will be happy within you, pleasure within you, which is within Chachma. So just to explain this in a simple term, it would mean that Chachma is mashpia, it gives to Bina, which is, it's a father, mother, that gives to Bina, and then what gets born from that union becomes Zah, which is the Ben, which is the son, which in this case would be Yisrael, and the revelation of the Neshama is in Zah, but the actual source, as it is in Chachma, is in the level of Netzach and Haid. And that's what we call also the Mazel, the constellation of the Neshama, which we call the level of the surrounding force, the Mekif that's above, which we explained before in Na'asit b'chag ve'asela. But we have to understand that there in Na'asit b'chag ve'asela it says the Mazal, that's the level of Yisrael al-Machshava, which is the level of al-Machshava means in thought, which is the highest level of Chachma, that which is connected and cleaving to Keser. And also there we said al-Machshava means in Adam Kadma'a, Machshava K'duma, the original thought. And so all too we also find in the Maimer Azinu Hashemayim. And Yisrael Saba on the other hand is only Netzach v'Hoid of the level of Chachma, of Abba, which is the lowest level of Chachma. He says, but in Parshas, this is the question. But he says in Parshas Breishis, which is the introduction to Zaire, he says it by Rav Amnuna Saba. So it says there, why is he called Saba? He says there, when he was looking for his name, he says, my father, Havarav v'Yakira, he was very honorable, etc. Va'atik yoimin, an old man of stature. So he says, we see there that the level Saba, which means old, and the word Atika are connected. It's all one. Which means that the neshama of Amnuna Saba came from the place of Yisrael Saba, which we know that this what it says, Yisrael Saba is called Aktik Yoimin. This is similar to the idea that from Tvuna, in other words, Atik and Saba are connected. Now, we also see that the level of Yisrael Saba is called similar to the level of Tvuna. As we say, the Tvuna makes the Keser, the crown for Zah. Okay, so how does this work? The work is that we just said before that the way the neshama is born is that, at least this higher level of neshama, we'll see later, it must be born through a lower level. But ultimately at this level, the chachma has a union with bina. So the lowest level of chachma, knetzach and haid of chachma, is called Yisrael Saba. Its connection is with the highest levels of bina, which is called tuvuna. So tuvuna becomes the crown for Zah. And that's why it's called Yisrael Saba, the old Yisrael. Because this is the soul of Keser, this soul of Keser, so to speak, is called Atik Yomin in comparison to Zah. Why? Because Atik Yomin, so to speak, is the inner Keser and its neshama. Okay, so according to this, it comes out very well that the neshama comes from the level of, as we said before, Yisrael Saba and Tvuna, which is called its mazel. And that's considered, in comparison to the neshamas of Zah Malchus, it's called Atik. It could even be called all these different terms, but it's the Keser for it, even though it's not the level of Netzach and Haid. And this also what we see similar in the beginning of Parshas Noach, about the idea that says Noach 2 times, for the inner light of the neshama and the surrounding light of the neshama. But in truth, he says, just like the true Keser of Zah really is happening from Arach Ampin itself, that's even higher than Chachma, as it says in Eitz Chaim, the same way the true mazel of the neshama is really from the crown of Atzilus, and the original thought, etc., even higher than we just mentioned before, the level of Tvuna and Yisrael Saba, where we had an explanation how it could be called Atik Yomin and the Keser of Zah. And also we could say, we know that the source of the neshamas comes from the level of Yisrael Saba and Tvuna. That's what it says in Eitz Chaim, Sharman Umad. And it says there that it's called, that Zah is called the son to our Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's in the beginning. And then you have a person, first it's called a son to the Eibusher, and then if he has more zichus, so then they give him a neshama from the side of Abba ve'ema, of Chachma and Bina. Which means that from this a union, the supernal union of Abba ve'ema, of Chachma and Bina, from there comes out the neshamas of people. But as those neshamas come out, they're not proper made yet, and they're also not complete. Until Zah Malchus has their own unification of Atzilus, and then they come out of that unification as they are from the Chachma and Bina itself. So basically, there's this neshama that is coming from the Chachma and Bina, it's in its source, which is getting from its Keser all the way higher from Chachma, from Keser and Arach Ampin, etc., as we said in Atik Yomin. But then it has to be revealed in Zah Malchus, so there's a double, and you could relate to each level on its own. And look in Zer Mishpatim, Mikdash Malach there, in the Zer Chel Gimel, and then he says this word says that because they have the level of Chai and Neshama from Abba ve'ema, which is the higher levels of the soul, they're called Achim and Reim, they're called brothers to Zah, because they come from the same source. As Zah comes from Chachma and Bina, so too these neshamas do, and from Zah Vatzilas, Zah Menukva Vatzilas. Then on the other hand, we come at a lower level, then we become Ben, because then we're a son also of Zah and Malchus, because from that union is where our neshamas come out in a real way. And that's what he says, we call Bekadshe Shemecha, the ones who holy your name. What does it mean? Shemecha, that goes on the way Malchus goes, that descends into Biyah, and it gets sent back into Atzilus, which is the level of Kodesh, through the Jewish people. Mekadshe Shemecha, that they were able to draw down the level of Kodesh, through saying 3 times Kodesh, which that is the level of Chachma Bin Das, we said with wisdom. Everything gets refined. And that's what means Mekadshe Shemecha, that in other words, to be able to bring down the level of Shema, which is the level of Chachma as it is in Tikkun, to refine the level of Ban, which is Malchus, as it's bringing up all the different nitzutzim from the worlds of Biyah, and how we refine it through this union that the Jewish people are able to achieve. And look what it says in the Maimar Eisri Legefen. And this level of Chachma, the Jewish people specifically are the ones who draw it down, because they are from the level of Yisrael Saba and the level of Tfuna. Why? Because the level of Tfuna, that is where the revelation of the thought of the Hispainus comes, which really from that revelation is where you have and drawn this level of pleasure as it is in Gan Eden Elyon, the higher Gan Eden, the lower Gan Eden, which that is in the revelation of the pleasure as it is in Keser, which is the source of all pleasure. Why? Because Eden itself, the level of pleasure is the level of Chachma. But there is no pleasure in a revealed way. Because there's nothing, it's all nullified, there's nothing. So rather, the main revelation is specifically in Tfuna and the level of Bina, when there's actually an understanding. There all of a sudden there's a greater and there's a real tangible experience of this Tainug. And he says, for example, this is like we see by a person, that the revelation of Tainug is when he fully understands, at the end of the understanding of the intellect. In other words, just in the idea itself, there's not the full pleasure. It's when you fully encompass and fully understand it, so too in tfuna specifically is where you have the idea of pleasure. And therefore, being at the source of Neshamas Yisrael from this level of this pleasure, as it's known, that when you have the seeding that happens in a relationship is only at the end of intimacy, and which is a time of pleasure, as we see by Shimshon and Vatal it says that Delilah would slip away from him at the point of the end of Bia. The same way, that's this Vatal Tseyu that she was bothering him. In other words, that's when the main pleasure is. And the same way in Neshamas Yisrael, they come from where? They come from the pleasure that's happening at, so to speak, this Gemar Bia, which is when these Chachma and Tvuna are united together. So this is from this pleasure that comes from above, which is specifically when there's the giving of the Hashpah, because Rabbi and he explained. In other words, he's explained why specifically by the giving of the Hashpah. Why? Because by Hashem, you can't say there's any type of pleasure, because he doesn't need anything, as we'll see in a moment. Rather, the pleasure is from that which he gives. As the Rabbi said, more than the calf wants to nurse, the mother wants to, the calf wants to suckle, the mother wants to nurse. And this is the level of pleasure that's above, which is the tainug, the pleasure of making and giving to the neshamas. And therefore, they have a power, because they come from this pleasure, that they're able to elevate the malchus to be from the level of mekadshe shemecha, that they could bring the holy, the level of kodesh into shemecha, that they can make it holy from below to above. As we say, you are betrothed to me, which is the word mekudeshes, that means you could be totally betrothed to Zah, her husband, in Atzilus, and ascend from the level of Biyah. And that's what he says that above. There can't be any type of pleasure. He says it's not understood, because we see the other way around. That we say with Hashem, he's the source of all life. He's the source of pleasure. Where it says strength, vechedva, and pleasure are in his place. But so he is the pleasure. He does have pleasure above. He says, the idea is that he says in other places that the pleasure that it is above, so to speak, is not, for the example, as there is pleasure in a person. Because a person, he receives pleasure from something that was outside of him. Like, for example, he understands something, which is a beautiful idea, or from eating something sweet. And even the neshamas that have pleasure over Hashem, in Gan Eden, they have to receive this pleasure through what they understand. In other words, these souls, they have what they understood of what they grasp of the light of the Shekhinah. So there's something that there is that they could grasp. On the other hand, by the Eibishter, there's nothing outside of him that you could say that he's receiving a pleasure from something outside of him, heaven forbid. But the opposite, he himself is the source of all pleasure. If so, he and the pleasure is one, so to speak. As we say, he's the knower, he's the knowledge itself. That means the knowledge and him are one. They're not two separate things. So the same way he and the pleasure are only one. It's not him and his need, him and his pleasure. There's him, that's all there is. And the pleasure and that whatever he needs is just him. And this is what's called the pleasure of Hashem in itself. Which is explained in the Sefer Emek HaMelech, and Yitzchayim has mentioned this. And that's where it says that it will be a pleasure, it'll be a play, like a toy, shashuim, a pleasure toy before Hashem. So that we see that the Eibishter does receive pleasure from the actions of tzaddikim. As we say at Ben Yaakov Ephraimim, Yaled Shashuyim. The word shashuim is used here. And it's also in the Zohar, many places, as the Eibishter in the world to come will lishtashtea, he'll play with the tzaddikim in Gan Eden. And so this pleasure and this play, this idea of receiving pleasure. So how can you say this will be by the Eibishter? That he will receive some type of pleasure? Is there anything lacking in the king's home, in the palace, that you'll have to receive something? And absolutely the opposite. We say he is the complete of all, and from him is everything. So there's no lacking of anything. So the answer only is that this playing and pleasure with tzaddikim is that he is, so to speak, being pleasured from that which he gives to the tzaddikim, not what he's receiving from the tzaddikim, which that is the pleasure, an unlimited pleasure, like a rabbi said, more than the calf wants to nurse, etc., or suckle. If so, he's not receiving, heaven forbid, anything, because the opposite. The tainug is from what he's giving. Only this hashpah, this giving, cannot be except when there's tzaddikim. In other words, because if they're not tzaddikim, then they cannot receive what he's giving. They won't be able to appreciate it, or they won't be able to keep it. Only when your person is at the level of a tzaddik, he's able to receive the hashpah of the Torah and the mitzvahs, because they become now garments and food for their soul, and therefore they're able to receive the light of God that is being given to them. And that's when he gets the pleasure, when he's able to give to them. And that's what he says of here, that above is not possible to have any pleasure, meaning he can't receive any pleasure from the outside of him, heaven forbid. Only he himself is the source of all pleasure. But there's this idea of receiving pleasure from that which he gives to others, as our rabbis have said, more than etc. And this creation of the source of the Neshamas Yisrael, it comes from this level of pleasure, because the whole creation of these Neshamas is for this pleasure, and they're born from this pleasure, so to speak. As it says, who did he refer to? When he wanted to create the world, the souls of tzaddikim, that he looked at the pleasure he would get from them. That pleasure is what brought about their birth. And look what it says in Eitchaim Sharman, Umad, Drush Beis. And also look what it says when the Eibishter went up in his desire to make the world. And therefore, because the Jewish people come from this level of pleasure, therefore they're able to be the ones that holy his name, as we said before. And look in Zer Vayechi. And look now, the place is an idea of Tzchak Asali Alikim, that Hashem made for me a joy, which that is the idea of Tzchak, laughter, and the pleasure, the supernal one that comes from the name of Alikim, which is the same idea here, which is that there should be a thing that is of self, something totally separate. And then by nullifying this separateness, this self, through that there becomes this pleasure above. And this is the idea that the Leviathan was made to be played with. As it says in the Maimer, it tells me, and also the Maimer, which is Yeschem, and another Maimer, and that is the idea of Zman Simcha Seinu, Tzmach Hashem B'Masa, the time of our joy. And as there is two, and this is looking in Maimer Shmini about how, for example, there's two types of pleasures by a king, and also in Seisasis, about how it accomplishes a Simcha in Hashem. But the main point that I think that we have to just know from this is the idea that specifically when the Hashpah comes in a place of self and it gets transformed, and we make that, so transformation, that is where we make this joy for Hashem, which Hashem, so to speak, gives to us for that, rather than just the fact that we're giving something to him that, so to speak, he needs. The Beis. He says, this is what it says, the yain l'samach l'vavenish, that the wine will make glad the heart of a man. Which we know the idea, if it goes in wine, it comes out a secret. What is the secret? This is this pleasure that there is in the Jewish people, and the revelation of this pleasure is the joy of a mitzvah, which is the great asher, which asher is from a term of pleasure. It says asher eya, I will be. But in that verse, he's talking about a pleasure that with the Jewish people. In the revelation of this joy, this is the idea of making your desire like his desire, which means your desire is lower than intellect. And through making your desire like his desire becomes like yours through the hisbainus and through the thinking into the greatness of Hashem, etc., that accomplishes the idea of wine. And what happens through that is an even greater thing that has to happen, which is that your desire becomes like his desire. In other words, that he makes your desire like his desire, which is that you become to a level higher than intellect, higher than knowledge, which is the idea of the crown that was crowned by his mother, which he explains. The crown is not the mother level of Bina itself. Only Bina is what accomplishes it, just like a physical crown is a thing for itself, and other people make it. The people make it, but not the crown and the people are not the same thing. And the main crown is really the revelation of the level of Chachma, the light of Chachma, which, in other words, he says, to be able to have the wine, which makes glad the heart of man, which is the inner level, it has to bring out the secrets of the inner levels. Like when we see when someone drinks a little bit of wine, it makes his heart happy, and then when he drinks too much wine, it makes your whole mind go crazy. And that's why they would pour on the mizbeach in very small measures, a half a hin for a cow, a third of a hin for an ayil, for a ram, because the mizbeach is the level of the malchus, and the wine, which is the drawing down of bina, or the arousal of bina, has to be with the right measurement, because from bina there are negative things that come from there. And therefore the sin of Adam Rishon was that he actually squeezed a cluster of grapes. And also Noach, the sin was that he got drunk and he revealed himself in his tent. Which from this came the chamsa, etc., and the whole story there. But rather, that's too much wine. Rather, it has to be in a special measurement just to make the heart happy. Which that is an inner level to arouse, in other words, the bina, being that bina tfuna is the level where the tainug is. So through arousing there, you arouse the keser, which is the crown itself, which is a supernal pleasure. That gets aroused through what? Through the joy of a mitzvah. But once you arouse the crown, the main thing is that you draw back down into and through the level of chachma to actually brighten the face, to shine the face of oil, which a level of oil is silent. In other words, when they stand, the angels stand, their wings become weakened. as the pasuk is, which their wings are that which they fly, as we said in the previous mind with Ava V'Yira, and they're burning up in a frenzy to God. But then there comes this shuv, this return, trapena, they weaken, and they become totally nullified. And this revelation of the light of Abba, of Chachma, which breaks through the lights of Bina, and it says, Vayavar Hashem al panav, that Hashem passed over his face, that it descends to go down in a clothing of lights into vessels, the light of Torah that comes into the physical things of the world, trumas and maestros. That's the main purpose. And this is what it says, Adam is aleph dam, aleph with blood, because the excitement and the joy that comes from the level of blood, which is in the heart, and that's the idea of wine that makes one glad. But then there's the aleph, which the aleph is the level of chachma, which it sweetens this excitement and sweetens these negative things, because the part of this excitement is the self. And the Chachma is going to nullify that self and sweeten it. And as it says, because you didn't serve God with Simcha, that's only in the beginning. But that's not the main purpose, because it's only a desire for God. But there has to be a return to Echad, which is to draw down the light of Abba specifically, that the light of Abba specifically should be revealed, and the light of Ema are only there to make happy and to arouse, but that's not the full purpose. And therefore, by the bracha of Simcha, which is a level which is of unity, this intimacy, as we say, that with the light of your face, he gave us a Torah of life. Which, what is this light of the face? This is the revelation of the light of Abba, and this is what it says, to shine the face, specifically from oil, which is the level of Chachma. Look in these different sources, and he says, but the level of oil, that's the level of nullification. That because the Simcha, the joy comes from wine, which is in its source higher in the intellect. But when the level of Abba comes down below in Netzach and Hoy, then it's called Lechem. So here we have a new there's number one Shem the way it is at a higher level that's still in the intellect. That's the level as it is still in intellect. But then there's a level as it's going to come down into the lower worlds. So what does it mean the lower worlds? So when it comes down from level of Chachma, even lower than Bina, and it comes now down into levels of Netzach and Hoy, then it's called bread. And that's what it says, that bread will satisfy the heart of man. What does it mean, satisfy? This is the power of Torah that gives the power for the weakness of the neshama, that it could overcome its trials and tribulations down here. And it says in the pasuk when the Jewish people look there in the Mimer. And the same way, this heart of man, which is the level of Malchus, that goes down into Biyaz, we said before, Enesh goes on the weakness and the one who is ill and lacking, and we in the previous Maimarim. So that is where it goes down into Biyah, Yordis Mavis, its feet go down into the place of death, which is in Biyah. And so the power to be able to go down, and even more so, in other words, to overcome there, but then also to actually ascend from there, back into Atzilus, is specifically through which power? Through this power of the light of Abba, of Chachma that happens in Netzach and Hoid, of Zah, which are what? Now he comes another additional thing, the level of letters. Letters. Netzach and Hoid, we say, are the two thighs, and the feet, which are the level, which come from the thighs, they're the level of letters, just like a letter. The feet take a person from one place to another through the same way, through letters and words, we're able to draw down more intellect. In other words, we understand more, we can take it to further places with more words and more language. And that's what the level of chita, which is wheat, which we said wheat is the gematria of 22, which 22 letters are why? Because the wheat is also a level of wisdom. As we know that a child does not know how to say the word Abba, doesn't call out father until he tastes wheat, he tastes some type of grain. But this level of chachma, as it is in the wheat, is a very small, katnus, very immature level. As we see in the Maimer of Esfat with regard to the Yantif of Shuas, which that's the level of letters that are in Chachma. And where are these letters in Chachma? They're in Netzach and Hoid as they are in Zah, and even lower, that's there we have the tree of knowledge, which is good and bad, and that is where the Chachma gets enclosed and where it descends at a level of bread, for what? To give it strength. In other words, it's not a level of joy there like the wine, because bread has no taste and sweetness. And that's the level of Malchus, that it says not on the bread itself does a man live, but rather on the word of Hashem that's in it. And yet, even so, you need bread as it's known, because you can't just drink wine on an empty stomach, empty heart. And therefore, you have this idea there, lachmoi belachmi, that you have there your bread with his bread, which is two breads, netzach and hoid, which they are netzach and also hoid. Iu benetzach, he is in netzach, and she is in hoid. So he said in hoid, which is with an akuda, a vowelization of a malapum, Therefore, it's called lachmo lachmoi, and also it's also a plural, which goes at the level of malchus, which is going from the plural domain, the public domain, which is a separate mountains, and it connects with what? With lachmi, which that's the level of netzach, which is the nikud of a chiruk, which is the private domain. Which afterwards, because of this unity of lachmai b'lachmi, you could have this wine that brings joy, and there could also be this shining of the face of oil, specifically because of the crown that he was crowned by his mother. But this crown, to be able to get to this now, he's saying there's another level, which that is you have to go out. You have to go out from Atzilus. Because in Atzilus, everything is in the makifim, and the surrounding lights, and all is one with Hashem, and nothing is revealed, and nothing is seen, because it's all one. Only you have to go out, the daughters of Tzin, that means you have to go out, daughters of Tzin, meaning the levels under Malchus, have to go down into the chambers of Bria, which there things are felt and things are revealed, and there you can have the revelation of this pleasure, specifically when going down, Tzenu Re'ena, only then could you start getting the power and the ability and all these other levels of the lechem, the shemen, and the oil, and the wine. So to understand the idea of bread, that we see that the bread specifically brings about the satisfaction of the heart of the man, even more so than wine. And we also see, as explained here, that the source of bread is from chachma, which is higher in the level of wine, which comes from bina. We'll also understand this from what it says in the Igeres HaKodesh in the beginning, on the verse Chago Beis Masna, that she girds with strength her loins, which the ois here, with the strength refers to Torah, which gives the power and the strength to the level of the thighs and lower. As it says, we see the place of the thighs, where the netzach v'hoides are called the two thighs, at same places where you also have on the inside the level of the kidneys, which, as we know, the netzach and hoid are called the kidneys that give advice. Now it's explained in Eitz Chaim that there's a netzach hoid yisoid new ones that are drawn down from the level of keser. In the Eitz Chaim it says, this is the language, that Arach Ampin, which is a level of the crown, which is called Kel Elyon, the supernal Lord, is the one, Goimel, he's the one that Goimel Chasad Tovim, that bestows good kindness, which is Netzach Chod Yisoid, of the smaller face of Zah, which brings him out in a way of something new from an additional thing which is new. In other words, there's this novel new Netzach Chod Yisoid that's constantly being renewed, which is coming from where? The level of Arach Ampin. And look also there, the explanation of the Ramaz, Parshas Bereishis, with regard to the Cholei Seim, what he says in the Likkutei Torah and the Drush of Netzach Chod Yisoid HaChadashim. And that's where it says, he girds, but what he gartles, chagra, he binds with strength, masneha, which is strength which refers to Torah, which its source is in the crown. And from there gets the strength and the power for the masnayim, for the feet that go down, which are Netzach and Hoid, that go down into the world of Biyah. And the idea is, for example, we see that if the person, even though he could understand with intellect, yet he doesn't not necessarily be able to teach it to somebody else. Except for himself, he understands it, but he can't really give that over to another person so that others should understand. And the reason for this is because he's not so smart. He doesn't have that much intellect, and so great an intellect. And therefore it's enough for him to exempt himself and to understand things himself, but he's not able to find within himself the ability to give over to others. And it says in Igeres HaKodesh in the Dumas Havin Mashal Melitza, that in other words, he says there that and to be able to give over to others, you have to have advice and you have to have ideas within yourself how to give it over in a manner that the one who's receiving it could actually receive it. Because if you'll say it just the way it is in his own intellect, this small person or your son, which is much younger and immature, will not be able to understand and receive what you're explaining and saying. Only have to make it in an orderly way, and everything set in its right place, little by little. And this idea, this eitzah, is called netzach and hoy, which are the kloyes yoyetzos. They are called the kidneys that advise. Also, we know netzach and hoy, they're called the shchakim, which are like the heavens. They're called the heaven called shchakim. Which what is that? It's called also the mill and the grinders that grind the man for tzaddikim. As we know that somebody who grinds within a mill, that it breaks up the wheat into tiny pieces, like flour. The same way a father has to make very small the intellect that he's doing and the wisdom that he's trying to give over to his son, and to break it down into a lot of pieces, to say little by little with a lot of ideas and advice in good ways and understanding, as explained there in Igeres HaKodesh. And therefore, someone who doesn't have such great intellect, he's not able to find this ability within himself to give it over. And therefore, even though he understands the intellect well for himself, he can't give it over to somebody else. Only one who's a great intellectual person, he's able to give it over because of his great intellect and the depth that he has in his knowledge. He's able to come up with ideas how to give it over even to a child that's immature. And so it comes out that this ability of Netzach and Haid, where is its source that it's able to grind things down, comes from the greatness of the intellect, which is even higher than the essential intellect that you're giving over. And therefore there's one who understands the intellect, even so he cannot give it over. And the same way we understand this parable as it is above, that this is the idea that Netzach Haid Yesod, the new Netzach Haid Yesod that are new, that are coming down from Keser into the worlds of Biyah, that are constantly being recreated, that this new sustenance that's coming in, where is its source? From the highest of high, it's coming from the levels of beyond even Chachma, from Arach. Okay, and look at what it says about this in the Pasuk Elam Maseh. Because we say the worlds of Biyah, B'riyah, Tzir, Nasiya, the lower worlds of animation, of creation, of formation, and of being, are all limited beings, and there's no comparison. The world of Atzilus, which within it there is the light of Ein Sof Baruch Hu, the light of God itself, and therefore to be able to draw down the light and the life force from the level of Atzilus, where everything is one, to the level of B'riyah, Tzir, and Asiyah, that is specifically through the levels of Netzach and Haid, which are called the balancing, the perfect balance, that they weigh how and in which way, the scale, that how and which way this sustenance should come down from the level of tzedek, which to the level of malchus, which is malchus ta'atzilis, which gives life to bria, yitzir, and asiyah, and this is the idea of these kloyos, these kidneys that give over. And he says, therefore, also the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu was also only from the levels of Netzach and Haid, as the Arizal says in the Shar Nevuah, and it's also brought down in Igeres HaKodesh in the יותר Kasalma, that from higher than Netzach and Haid, there's no grasp of any Navi, no seer has ever seen, doesn't see past Netzach and Haid. And therefore also this creation, the making of this Netzach Haid Yesod, these new ones, which is this level of eights, as we said before, how to give to the source of Bria, Tzir, and Asiyah comes specifically where? From the level of Keser. And this is similar to what it says, HaMakbil HaShavas, that the one who is exalted to come down, Hamashpili Lirais B'Shamayim V'Aretz, then lowers himself to see in heaven and earth, which the meaning is, because he is so high, therefore he's able to come down so low, because what is low is equal to him, because all the high and the low becomes equal. And therefore he's able to lower himself even into the land as he is in the Shemayim. And that's what he says in Zohar Parshas Balak on the Pasuk Hashem Lekai Atorei Mimcha Ede Shmecha Ki Asisa Pella Eitzis Merachik Emuna Uman, which the pasuk there, he says this idea of eitzis merachik. There's advice from the distance. What is this? He says these are the two stems of the aravis, of the willows, that every time that the Nevi'im had a revelation, it comes from that level, which is called the advice from the distance. Meaning, at the level of Netzach and Haid, which are the level of the Eitzes, they receive their power from the distance, which means from the level of Chachma and Keser, as it says, I said with wisdom, which is very distant from me. That wisdom is a level of distance. And now this it says, Ki Asisa Pella, that you make also wonders. That it comes down this level of wonders of Chachma, which is higher than that which we could understand. And that's what it says, Pella Yoyetz, the wonder that advises. The level of Netzach and Haid Yoyetz comes specifically from the level of Pella, which is all the way back from Chachma. And that's the idea that she girds with strength, specifically Masneha. What does it mean with ba'ois? Ba'ois, this strength, with the strength of Torah, which is Netzach and Haid, which comes from the deepest of levels, that's the way you have Masneha, which are the thighs that go down into the world of Biyah, gets its strength. And that's the greatness and the level of Torah, which is called Lechem, which this level of bread is in Netzach and Haid. And that's what it says in the Zohar, this Lechem, this bread, that it goes from the level of Shchachakim, as we said before, this mill and grinder that grinds the month to be eaten for the tzaddikim. As we said before, like the example of a wheat that is broken down and made and ground into very small pieces. The same way the letters of the Torah, they come down into this world until every single person is able to receive, and the same thing the divisions of all the laws of Torah, of the oral Torah, and therefore, even though it comes down even lower than the level of wine, and it has no taste of sweetness, and like we said before, the Netzach and Haid, which are the stems, the branches of the Arava, which have no taste, as we know, yet their source is much higher than the level of much higher. In other words, it comes from a level of Chachma and Keser, as we said before, Eitzis Mirachik, in the distance. And this is similar to what Shlomo Melech said, that I know wisdom, it's distant from me, that the source is from the hidden intellect, which is hidden from all ideas, and it's called the Pella, the wonder, and from there it draws down in the level of Netzach and Hoid, that there could be this level of the bread of the wheat, through that which it gets ground, this wheat, to many pieces in the levels of Netzach and Hoid. And that's where it says, from the distance she brings her bread. Again, from the distance comes the level of bread. And this is what it says in the Zohar, meaning that this bread, its source is from a very high place, which is very distant from all the Vav worlds, and therefore also this bread specifically is able to sustain and give strength to the heart of Enosh, of the man. And this will understand also the idea of the luchais, the two tablets. We explain other places that it says in if you go on my statutes, and it says there, that it was engraved into the luchais. In other words, that it was carved from within them. And he said, this is what it says, that Hashem carved, the carving in the level of Tehirui law, which is the Keser in the highest of the worlds, which that's the level of Keser. Look, and therefore, also we find 620 letters in the 10 Commandments, because it's also a level of Keser. And yet, we know that if you look in Pardes HaKlalim, it says that the Luchais are the levels of Netzach and Hoid. And that's also what he says in Eretz Chaim. And according to this, it all comes out clear. And that's what it says, like in Pri Etz Chaim, like we said before, that Kel Elyon, which is the level of Keser, the supernal God, what it happens, Goimel, he bestows Chasadim Toivim, good kindness, which is the levels of Netzach and Hoid, as it is in Zohar. One specifically comes from the other. The level of Keser comes down into the two tablets, which are Netzach and Hoid. And look also what we said about the letters of Torah in the Maimer Ner Chanukah, etc. And that's the same level of bread. And look also in Maimer Sfatim Lechem with regard to the level of wheat, being 22 letters of the Torah, which also their source comes from the letters that are carved in the Luchais, and how it's connected here. And we'll continue the Maimer next week.